community living and careers. The purpose of this webinar series is to provide additional information and clarification on the discovery process. Today's webinar focuses on informational interviews, a critical element of discovering personal genius, Griffin, Hammis and Associates discovery process. Many of you learned about this valuable tool during the two-day discovery training. Today's webinar will provide additional information and clarification. Although there is no specific VR authorization code for informational interviews, they may be conducted as part of a VR authorization. For example, perhaps an informational interview is conducted during a job shadow. In another situation, an informational interview may be conducted during the development of a situational assessment. Today's webinar focuses on the practice of informational interviews. All questions should be typed in the chat box and will be answered at the end of the webinar. Questions related to how it fits into VR authorizations or billing and paperwork questions, which cannot be answered, will be collected at the end of the webinar and sent to VR. Answers will then be provided in a Q&A. If anyone has any connectivity problems, use the chat box to indicate. Items to download are available on the left panel. It is now my pleasure to introduce Patty Cassidy, consultant with Griffin, Hammis and Associates.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Kelly. It's my pleasure today to share with you information about informational interviews and to provide you some guidance and additional details about the purpose, the process, and what can be accomplished during an informational interview, where we can actually add to the knowledge that we have about job seekers during the discovery process. We really want to think about the concept of an informational interview in terms of discovery, because it is not job development. Although we are making connections with business leaders or business owners or an entity such as a manager or a supervisor within a business setting, we are not involved in the job development process yet, and yet we are still in the discovery process. So let's talk just briefly through some of the components of discovery and see where the informational interviews fit. Certainly, the discovery process includes a variety of tasks that we as employment vocational staff complete in getting to know the job seeker well. That would include things such as making a home visit to get to know the person where they are at their best and where we can gain some insight into this person from a personal perspective. Also, getting to know the person's neighborhood and community, places where we might find connections in the community or associates or friends that can help, or even businesses and transportation within the community and the neighborhood. We also will be talking with other people who know the job seeker well in terms of gaining additional insights, that getting to know that person with a 360-degree view, so we know the person from a variety of perspectives that can add to our knowledge about the job seeker. And we want to interview those people to gain additional insights in their perspectives. And then next we want to start that getting to know what people know how to do. The discovery activities phase is that process, those processes of watching, observing, being engaged with the job seeker, where we get to know what they know how to do. It's the doing part of discovery, not just simply conversations and sitting across the table asking questions, but actually getting to do things with the person so you can see what the person knows how to do in terms of tasks and skills and needs for support, those kinds of things. At this point, we're going to start to develop what we call our vocational themes. We're really wanting to come up with a set of words that help us describe the individual's culmination of a variety of things. And we want to start to verify that we're on the right track, because the vocational themes really help us formulate a plan for job development. So informational interviews comes after we start to develop a good set of words or phrases that we use for our vocational themes, and then we want to ensure or verify that we're on the right track. Informational interviews comes in at that point, followed by our vocational profile, or the narrative that really describes who is this person in a well-written, formulated process that truly captures the essence of the person and where we're heading. And then, of course, that is followed by those lists of 20 for job development, where we're identifying up to 20 different businesses, actual live businesses for each of the vocational themes that will help guide that. So we're going to be talking today just about that vocational interview process, and that's where we're going to kind of think about, why do we even do them in the process of discovery? Because most of us think about informational interviews or talking to employers or business people as a form of job development. And we want to talk about the informational interview as our means of bridging, I guess, if you will, the difference between before we get to job development, we're bridging the discovery or the assessment process into the job development. So informational interviews are not job development. They require a very different perspective going into the meeting with that business owner or manager or supervisor. Informational interviews can help us learn more than we currently do about work in a particular area. It helps us think through novelty, new ideas, things that we might not have thought about because we have not spent the time inside of a company. Sometimes we spend the time in job development looking for available openings. So it's really important that as we start to go into a particular area or area of interest for or on behalf of a job seeker, we really want to go into it based on those vocational themes, not based on just a simple interest or based on the job description that we have in mind, but we want to look at where we have culminated all of the information we've currently collected and use those vocational themes to help guide our contacts to do these informational interviews. We'll find skills and tasks that can be found in those workplaces and work settings that we may not have seen before. We may come up with some ideas about conditions of employment that would meet or maybe not meet the needs of support for the given job seeker we're representing. It helps us, I think, to gain information that we might not otherwise have. So I think that we need to go at the vocational, the informational interview with something particular in mind. Because realizing that those vocational themes are really broad and overarching terms or language that helps us think differently beyond the simple job description or even an industry where someone may or wish to work. I think that it helps us come up with ideas and thoughts that are based on not just a job seeker's interests, but their skills and their experiences. I think they make us be more creative. They help us think beyond the confines of traditional job searches. And it allows us to get behind the scenes of a business, not walking in the front door and seeing what happens just from where we meet the person at a desk, but getting more important information through this process. And lastly, I think what it does is helps us create and foster and develop some really good both business and personal relationships with and on behalf of the job seeker. It's one of the greatest connections that we can make is to help an individual who experiences a disability make connections with people who share similar interests. And it helps us create opportunities for people, not just find opportunities as entry level or jobs that we're most familiar with. So when we think about the informational interview, exactly what does that mean? I think that, in my perspective, I think that the informational interview helps us to further our knowledge about employment and work skills in a variety of businesses beyond what we currently know. It helps us to explore the person's interests and skills or to match those interests and skills that we currently know about that person. It can help inform the job development. So when we start to develop those lists of 20, through these informational interviews, we can determine whether we might want to go back to that industry or that business or remain in a particular line of industry similar to that business. Or it may be that we have determined and changed that vocational theme to something a little, tweaked it a bit so it changes some of our thoughts and ideas. But it certainly allows us to make new connections, new business relationships, new connections either for ourselves as job developers, vocational staff, or it can also help us to help make connections on behalf of the job seeker, people who might not be willing or able to hire, but can certainly add advice and guidance to the process. So they're very powerful tools that enable, I think, that we really need to employ these, not only by the informational interviews or only job development, but using two different approaches for different reasons. So obviously, no selling is involved. We are not there to sell our agency or our services, or even going into great depth about what we do. And it really is truly not a time for us to walk in and say who you are, who you represent, what kind of services you provide. But it's really more about simply asking, can you help me? I need advice about careers and work. Wondered if you could give me some advice. Can you give me some help? And I think it's really as simply as that people are willing to help. And I think that we have to consider what we're doing in terms of why we're entering into this informational interview. So the question it needs to be asked is, are we doing this with or without the job seeker present? And of course, we always want and should almost always include the job seeker in the informational interview process. I mean, it's about their employment. We want individuals to experience getting to know people in community places. We want them to experience talking to business people, and for them to actually see work that's going on and learn firsthand. There are some times when maybe that isn't the right thing to do, and it's probably not as common, but it does happen. And I think this is when we work with some individuals whose disabilities are significant enough that they would not be able to participate meaningfully in the informational interview, and in fact might not be seen in the best light. I guess the one rule that we need to keep in mind always is that we do not let people with disabilities appear to be incompetent in any situation. So we have to be careful about going into these situations. If an individual, and I always use my example of a gentleman that I knew named Bill, who is a delightful person. He has a developmental disability, and he loves to get very animated with people. And as a matter of fact, sometimes likes to get people in a headlock, imitating wrestling, professional wrestling. As many years as we've worked with Bill to try to negate that behavior, he's just a real fun, animated man. So I might bring Bill a second time, but for the first time, I might go in and test the waters of whether the employer would be willing to talk again to Bill and explain further about this process, maybe repeat what he does with me on a short-term basis. So I think it's just important to think about the individuals if they are able to participate and understand that this is not a formal interview, that this is a time when individuals are going to be seeking information. And as a matter of fact, I don't even use the term informational interview with people that I represent or work on behalf of, because inevitably all they're going to hear is the word interview. So I usually talk about that we're going to go in and meet people who might be able to give us some good advice. And we're going today to just talk to people to get some advice. So I think that it's important that we always prepare for the situation, that we want to be able to dress appropriately. We have to be proactive in ensuring that the job seeker understands the circumstances, and I've had it happen many times where people, I left that up to someone else, either a family member or the individual themselves, or staff who were to help the person be prepared with appropriate professional clothing for this interview, this informational interview, and it didn't happen. So I'm always there a good half hour, 45 minutes before. I might even prepare the person with some questions and make sure that we have the appropriate clothes laid out. This would be a good outfit. We work together to kind of select that. So it really is important that we prepare as much as possible for this informational interview, and to second guess or just really be proactive in guessing whether this person should participate or not. I often do these informational interviews myself first because I feel like I'm not knowledgeable enough about a particular area, and I might be making a wrong guess in introducing someone based on that vocational theme. So sometimes I do them briefly myself beforehand. But almost always, I always include the job seeker. You have to remember that the person with the disability who's coming into this informational interview with us is going to be a part of that process. Then we've really got to think about that the connections we're trying to make through this process is really about personal advice and guidance. So people will come together when they have commonality, and it's up to us to help provide that kind of connection in the informational interview process. If I'm the one asking the questions, and generally, and I'll talk a bit about this in a minute, I'm generally the one that's guiding the questions because I have a whole lot more experience doing this than the job seeker I'm representing. They may have only done a couple of these with me, where I have done hundreds, if not thousands, of informational interviews in my lifetime. So I will make the point of pointing out the commonality. I will be aware that sometimes people will need to teach other people their skills, and I can look for the commonality and the interest that one person may have for another. But we do have to realize that we're just looking for advice at this point. And it's, I think you've probably, those of you who've heard me speak, or maybe my colleague Bob, we talk about this kind of like the introduction, dating, and marriage prospect. We're just looking for advice at this point. We're not walking in asking for a date or even asking for a marriage at this point. We really just want to know if we have anything in common, meaning in common with the job seeker and what their skills and abilities are. So we just have to be very cautious and prepared. So let's talk a little bit about what does it take for an informational interview. We're going to go through each one of these, from setting up an interview, preparing for the interview, questions to ask. You all have heard that term, smooth listening. We'll be talking about that process, and observation, and getting some warm leads. So let's talk a bit about each one. I think that setting up informational interviews is probably one of the easier things to do. I think for those of us who are also job developers, it can be very similar to that practice. But of course, the best kind of setting up an interview comes from referrals from people we already know, people who work in a particular business or industry or share a particular vocational theme. We might ask them if they know somebody, and we can do that from personal connections, our family members, friends, colleagues, coworkers, even business advisory committee members, or some of you have been involved with the development of community action teams, using your own agency board members, even the other business owners you may know, certainly can give you those warm leads, and they're the best that we can have, because you can drop a name and say, Bill Smith told me that you would be able to have this call with me. I think he might have already connected with you. Would you have some time for me? They're the best, but realize that don't be afraid to ask, that there is a lot of power in asking, and in asking for advice and help. It is rich with reciprocal relationships, where people would love to be asked for that, and that you in turn give your thanks, and the process of just the mutuality of it is just amazing. So don't be afraid to ask. So you might just want to do a phone call or a drop-in. I've had some great luck in doing some drop-ins with people, and always making sure I'm trying to picking the best times. But we're really not walking in asking for a tour. This is what we're going to be doing, is we're just going to ask for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. Our language might be some where we're not representing, like, hi, I'm Patty Cassidy, and I represent Griffin, Hammis, and I help people with disabilities and employment. I wonder if you can help me, or I wonder if you can have some time. I'm looking for jobs for people. It's really being careful about what we say. So keeping it casual is really more of, hi, I'm a career counselor. I work for Griffin, Hammis. I wonder if you would be willing to give me 20, 30 minutes of your time. We're going to be asking for help and advice. So let me go through the little script that we have here and see if this would be helpful to you. I could do this in person, and I've done this both by cold calls walking in. I've done this with referrals that people have given me, and I've done this without any referral. But it's more of a, hi, I'm Patty Cassidy, and I'm a career counselor with Griffin, Hammis and Associates. And I'm assisting a job seeker, Nikki, who has a really strong interest in whatever it might be. Say that it's working with computers. And she's exploring opportunities in this field. Dave Adams from the Small Business Development Center recommended I give you a call and ask for some advice. We're hoping you will consider letting us come in and interview you to get your insight and advice on working and careers in this field, and maybe take a short tour of your business. Would you have time to meet with us, maybe for 20 minutes next week? Is Thursday available? That kind of very common introductory call. It's not laced with a lot of, human servicey lingo. It's really talking about community, and it's talking about advice and guidance for a job seeker or career. So just being careful and practicing this really is helpful. I think that planning and preparing questions is a very crucial part of this, as well as practicing, I might add. I think the more chances you have to practice this, possibly without job seekers initially, until you gain your own confidence in doing this, you will be better prepared to know how to plan your questions in advance. I think it's important to know what it is you're actually looking for in this process. Remember, you only have maybe 20 to 30 minutes, and you might ask only one or two questions, and people can be really big talkers. So you might only get a couple of questions, and you need to keep to the time that you've requested. It doesn't mean that people won't continue, but if you have asked for 20 minutes, make sure you stop at 20 minutes and say, I only asked for 20 minutes, our time is up. Thank you. Unless you have more time, I would like to thank you very much at this point. And sometimes people will go on, and I've had that happen many, many times. But just be prepared with the kind of questions that's going to guide the conversation, because that's the direction it's going to go. So if you want your goal to, be around a particular industry, the questions you'll ask will be very pointed towards industry as opposed to that particular business and what they do. If you're looking for questions that are related to that particular industry, that particular business, because they produce a product or have a product or a service that's very similar or matches the skills and interests of your job seeker, then your questions are going to be along that path as well. So just being aware of what you're looking for. Maybe a person has a particular set of skills, and you want to find out if people use that set of skills, and you're making these assumptions through your vocational theme that these are some businesses where we think those skills might be used. So you're going to be asking those questions in that regard. And we're also looking, to make sure that our vocational theme is correct. And there may be many different reasons why. But just realize that we're going to formulate those questions, and I'll give you a few of those in just a second. Got to remember that we have to be prepared to take notes. That as we're asking people for their advice and for their time, they're giving this freely, and they're not being paid for this. And so we want to be very respectful, and we want to be very authentic with the questions that we're asking and the advice that we're gathering. And taking notes is one of the most respectful ways of showing people that what they say is important, that it's important enough for us to write it down. And if we don't, then we're not necessarily thinking that, or at least we might be showing that we don't think that what they're saying is that important. Even if we have good memories, we should probably take a few notes just to let them know that we acknowledge their time and efforts in helping us out. So let's think a bit about some of the questions you might ask. I think that depending on our purpose and depending on the size of the company and who we actually are communicating with, I think that the starting out is some of the questions might be more personal. We might ask questions regarding how did you get started in this industry? What was your interest in coming into this line of work? What did your career path look like? You might be asking very personal questions and then get more specific around that particular business or industry. But here are some of the variety of questions, and it might help you formulate some. And we do have a handout in the files section on the left side that can also help you with this. When I do informational interviews, I'm often not thinking about job development, so I don't always ask the questions about what are the prerequisites for the position, for a particular position, but asking questions about qualifications. What kind of positions do you have? What are some of the prerequisites for working here? What kind of characteristics do you look for in employees? Guide you to maybe the culture of the company, finding out the different kinds of positions they may have, even if you already know some or know of positions there, might help you uncover different kinds of work that might match your job seeker. Many times the folks we represent are people that don't have a rich work history and have maybe limited skills, or are just building on their vocational work skill set. So we're looking for those kinds of things that can help us see whether that particular business itself would be reflective of their skill sets and their vocational themes. Other questions could be more related to how people learn. So you might ask questions about who trains people in their jobs here. Is the prerequisite that people don't have to have a rich work history? They don't have to have the skills because we train people themselves. Then how are people trained? That would be real helpful for us to know, particularly for our job seekers who have unique needs on how they might need to be trained. So just be prepared for a variety of questions, knowing that you're probably not going to ask all of them. Actually, you're probably not going to ask many of them, but you might be a little bit careful about the kinds of questions you begin with. So if you're talking about your job seeker who has a particular set of skills or a particular set of interests, you can ask the person you're interviewing, what other types of work or industries do people who share similar interests or skills go into? Say that someone has a specific interest in design work, maybe interior design. Actually does great work or has some skill sets in doing home modifications or interior decorating. You might ask that if this person has a specific set of skills, where might other people who share these similar interests go? Asking questions about technology and the impact that has had on the industry, because sometimes we find people who don't have high technological skills are being moved out of positions that work is not available. So we need to know how technology impacts people in their work and what that might mean for the future. I'm going to think about advice, just asking general advice. If someone wishes to enter into this line of work, what kind of advice would you give them? What kind of background should they have? We're going to be asking questions about how people are to be prepared for work. What would you suggest in preparation? Is there any education or training that you might advise? We're going to be asking about, are there any other people that you think we might also want to speak with who could give us some advice? So those kinds of questions that we often think about in terms of giving us general advice, not such specific, is how we begin the conversation. We can also then ask a set of questions that can be very, very specific about the particular industry. We can talk about questions that are personal, and particularly when we talk to small business owners. I think that those people have a much more personal and vested interest in their business, and have a lot more detailed kinds of questions. So, a lot more details to the information we're seeking. And I think that those business owners are often much more willing to talk about themselves personally. So the kinds of questions that we're asking can also lead us to future comments and talks. So tell me why you started your business. Tell me about your customers. Who are your competitors? And then why do people choose you? Is there anything that you would like to have that would grow or expand your business? And if so, what would that be? These kind of questions can lead to further conversations later that might lead to job carving, job creation, or you could even take that similar kind of information to another business or industry where you can see growth potential, you can see resource ownership opportunities, you could even see some small business development opportunities for folks. But I think that sometimes these personal questions would be very, very powerful. I think that some of the other kinds of questions that we're looking for is advancement within a small company or in any company, but for these small business owners, they're often undercapitalized. They're small companies that might want to grow but don't have current resources. And often people with disabilities, with their interest, skills, and talents, their vocational themes, can come to a connection to a business owner that we might want to come back later to further that relationship with some resource development. So if money was no object, and that's kind of a very big and broad question, but if money was no object, what would you want? And we've seen many opportunities where small businesses needed a $5,000, $10,000 piece of equipment that would increase their competition, would increase their productivity, and often people with disabilities have resources available to them either through vocational rehabilitation, through Social Security work incentives, through a variety of ways that money might be available to a person with a disability who could purchase that equipment as long as it's part of their work and their job and can bring that to the business that would enable the business to hire them. So just thinking about the kinds of questions that guide us to a different way of thinking about employment instead of just wage jobs. So what would make you more competitive is a good question to ask. And then again, starting to think about if they do have employees, sometimes small business owners are very small, maybe only a few employees, what do you look for and where do you find them? So I think that, really kind of coming up with the ideas behind the questions we ask is really important to practicing that smooth listening and being able to listen to the answers and not be the ones who are asking very specific questions at this point in time. When I start to think of that, because I'm a job developer as well, I will start to think about work I've seen in other businesses and what would you do if you could switch this job, or what if you could take out that task and give it to someone else. We're not quite there yet, and we want to be careful about, at this point in the game, is not to be the experts on their business. We want to do less talking and more listening. And for those of you who have attended the training, we've been talking about that smooth listening, where we really want to ask open-ended questions. Any follow-up questions is simply to verify or to continue the conversation, but realize that sometimes we only have to ask a couple of questions and people will talk. They often love to talk about their business and what they do. At this point, we're just merely looking for good advice. So we've got to be careful about using our own personal stories, other jobs we've developed in similar businesses, spending time trying to look for trying to create a job because we're not there yet. And we don't want to jump to the job, not yet. We're just trying to verify those vocational themes. And we may come back later and say, I met with you a few weeks ago, or I really was enthralled by what you told me about that need for that piece of equipment, or your interest in growing your business in this area, and I wonder if I could talk with you further. For me, it's spending time getting to know somebody, coming back for a date. I think that next conversation might be a follow-up. That might be a follow-up to a date. So I think that really getting that advice and ending it certainly with what kind of advice would you have for, and whether if I'm doing the conversation by myself or I'm doing that with my job seeker, say Jim. What advice would you have for Jim, who might be interested in starting out in this field? And that's when we're really getting to know specifically the kinds of advice that people can give you that are that's helpful for a particular company or business or for a general industry in that particular line of work. So I'm just wondering, in some kinds, I think we find that there is a gap, or not a gap, an overlap between discovery and job development, and that occurs right here. It happens, if you can imagine, two circles overlapping, on the left side being the process of discovery, and on the right side being the process of job development, and all the tools that we use in the discovery side, and then all the tools that we might use on the job development side. The informational interview is a process where they overlap a bit. So I think that overlapping piece is where, in some cases, we're just getting advice, and in other cases, we start to create opportunity, maybe to come back, where we can do an activity. Maybe you see a task being done that you think the person might have an interest in doing, or the person themselves, the job seeker themselves, expresses, "Oh, that looks really good. I bet I could do that." And maybe even coming back and asking, what do you think? Do you think that Jim and I could come back next week and maybe we could try that task out? So you're adding to your knowledge about your job seeker. I think that we need to look for opportunities where this individual's current skill sets can be used, or where they can grow the skills that they have, potentially either in this business or in similar businesses. This helps you cement your vocational themes. We need to look for the unmet needs of that business. If we can get to those questions, they're usually more personal questions or more specific to a business, but those kind of unmet needs. Is there any work that's really important that needs to be done that seems to get set aside? And if so, what would that be? Can you show me that? I think about an optical laboratory where they would grind the lenses to fit the frames for an optician. And the billing section had lots and lots of paper and documents that had to be matched to an 11-digit alphanumeric code in order to be filed away. And that just kept getting stacked up and stacked up and stacked up. And just being observant, the job developer that I worked with said that she just noticed that as she was sitting there talking and asked, what is that over there sitting in those boxes? What is that pile of work? And I actually observed something that was an important task that had to be completed, or they couldn't bill for their lenses, but yet it got set aside. So sometimes we're looking for unmet needs, looking for opportunities to come back. We're also looking for opportunities to really point out the job seeker's skills and abilities. So in the context of that conversation, the individual that the staff person that I knew who saw those 11-digit alphanumeric coded documents was able to point out that the person, the job seeker she represented, happened to be excellent at doing alphanumeric filing and coding. Something that she was very good at doing. I just made that as a simple comment, not, she's really good at doing that. Do you want to hire her? But just in context of just pointing out a skill set so that the person who's being interviewed gets to hear that this person has a good set of skills, and that the job seeker is giving some acknowledgement, some accolades, some credit for skills that they have in the context of a business connection. I think that we really need to be observant about other aspects of employment beyond just wage jobs. And I think many of us already have become highly skilled in doing job carving, job creation, where we can identify and break out tasks that can be done, unbundle some tasks and bundle them back together. But really looking at alternatives to employment, just plain old wage jobs, could be those resource ownership and small business options. So just keeping our minds open at this point in the process, because we're not in the job development phase yet. So I think that we just need to be cautious about the process of what these informational interviews can do. I think that one of the things is that we are really here to ask for advice. And that is about as clear as we can get in terms of the questions that we ask. There are resources online that you can look up, certainly being aware that the concept of an informational interview was actually developed by, I can't remember the gentleman's name who wrote the book, What Color is Your Parachute? And then you can go into do a search and find lists of questions that can help you formulate a set that would help, whether you're looking for career advice in a particular industry, whether you're looking for information that has context to the specific growth in an industry, what kind of education or training should this person be doing, but realizing that what we're looking for is a set of sets of information that can give advice to growing a person's career. So I think that we need to think about why we use the informational interview. Let's go back to thinking about where do we fit in terms of the questions we ask. So if we're looking for trying to verify a vocational theme, we might need to do several different informational interviews for each of the themes. Some themes we might feel very confident about. We know the person's skill sets. We've been able to see the person. They have to doing tasks that they're confident and they're capable of doing competently. We may have people who have a rich work history. So we may already have some good ideas. But remember that our need for verifying those vocational themes is the primary reason, and then to help build our job development process. So I think I see some questions coming up on the side and some comments back and forth among people. So I wonder if we might want to take a stop here and see if we have some questions where we can verify or explain further some of what we're talking about today.
Hi, Patty. It's Kelly. We do have a few questions. The first question we have is, I'm a little confused on the phone script. I thought we weren't supposed to ask for a tour.
Right. I think that phone script was one that's just simply asking somebody, could we come in and do an informational interview? And then if you do have time, maybe we could do a little tour of the business. So it gives you a couple of ways to get some seat time first. And we have to remember that what we're looking for is not the tour first, but seat time to sit and talk with somebody about that particular business or industry. So you might mention that in the phone script, but if you don't ask for it, the person may not give you a tour, and that might be important depending on the business that you're going to visit. So I guess the point being is don't stress the tour, if that makes sense. I see where Liz has even answered. Liz Flowers is answering, and that she's correct that the tour is not the same as asking for a job. And tours can be used for other reasons too. Sometimes we can use a tour just to allow a job seeker some knowledge about what goes on behind the scenes. And so that's perfectly good. But that's not the tour is not the same thing as an informational interview either. Other questions?
Thank you, Patty. Another question there. Yep, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me, Patty?
Kelly? I'm having trouble hearing you, Kelly.
Hello?
I can hear you now. I can now, yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. The second question is, possible job at a hospital. Would you ask for the HR manager about an interview or the department manager?
If I'm doing an informational interview, I would first of all want to know why I'm going to the hospital. So say that the informational interview I want to conduct is based on a vocational theme of helping others, or health and medical might be my vocational theme, and I'm wanting to verify that. I would look for opportunities and places where I can speak to someone. Remember, I'm not looking for job development. I'm just looking to verify that there might be employment opportunities based on this particular person's skill sets. So if the person is a medical technician, say, for example, has a degree or a medical technician, I might talk to someone who works in the medical industry in that technology department and say, would you mind having an informational interview with us? This individual would like to know more about how you got in this line of work and give it some advice on careers. So I never would go to the human resources or personnel department for that kind of thing. I'm looking for very specific people who can add to that knowledge base. And then if I would have a person, say, who has a developmental disability, who may not have any kind of education or training or even a high school diploma, but wants to work in a health-related industry or hospital or medical industry, I might go talk to someone through hopefully a warm lead who would give me a connection to, say, someone who works in a nursing facility, or who might work in healthcare or health fitness center, or someone who might work in I'm trying to think of there's a health facility club here in my town that's connected to the hospital. It's related to the hospital. It's a couple of blocks away, but they have a strong focus on health and fitness, and they have some physical therapists and people working in that facility. I would try to find a connection to someone who works within that industry. So I'm not in job development yet. And then that would be another set of questions in terms of who would you contact when you have verified that theme. You've come up with your list of 20, and you now want to try to get someone into a hospital to work a specific job, then that would be a different approach. But the purpose of this is to just verify that the person's skills might match and might be needed within an industry. Does that make sense?
She says thank you.
Oh, good.
Another question is, does anyone find this helps build a relationship between you and the business owner?
Is that question being asked to everyone in general or to me personally? Because for me personally, absolutely. I find that many times when we do informational interviews, that person either becomes an eventual employer, meaning that individual will continue the conversation and relationship by either doing further informational interviews. They might come up with, I might be able to come back and do discovery activities, having the person do some kind of work in that place, that business, or it might end up being that that person ends up hiring someone. But usually, I would say probably 90% of the time, informational interviews leads to connections that remain. How are other people? Do they find that this works?
People are responding, and it looks like they're saying yes. I would say from personal experience as well, any conversation that you're having with a business is always a building relationship opportunity. There's one other question, Patty.
Yep.
The question is really the difference between discovery and job development. And I know that seems a big question, but can you talk a little bit about kind of where discovery falls in and then where job development falls in? Now, from a VR perspective, I can just explain a little bit that discovery is a separate type of authorization that comes in, and then job development is really when you are doing the resumes and going out and actually doing interviews with businesses. But can you talk about a little bit how those are different in your perspective?
I think I caught, you broke up a little bit at the end, but you're talking about the differences, like where does discovery end and job development begin?
Correct.
Kelly, if that's your question, I think that to me, discovery ends when you have at least 3, and then we usually fall on 3 solid vocational themes that you have verified, and that you have come up with your list of 20. So all of the activities that occur under what we call discovery, which was that list of things we started the conversation with today, from the home visit to the discovery activities to completing informational interviews, verifying themes, and writing your list of 20 for each of the themes. At that point, we are done. The discovery process ends, and we don't want discovery to last forever and ever. We can complete discovery for years if we want to, but that's not the intention. It's meant to be done in a short, time-limited piece of intensive effort and work over a 2 to 6 week period of time, depending on the job seeker, and then discovery is completed. So at that point, then job development begins. So as I was trying to describe, without a very good visual, of course, the kind of two overlapping or intersecting circles, we often used to have a good vocational profile, good discovery work done, a completed profile of who is this person, and then there would be this big gap between that completion and when job development starts. And often what we would find is we would go back to other kinds of job development that would just pull up an available job, and we ask the job seeker, do you want this? And they say yes. And DR counselors would come back and say, what the heck? You did all this wonderful work, but here you've got a job that doesn't really match any of these other things you were describing, these other 3 strong themes. What happened? And we will say, well, this looks like he wanted the job. So I think that this vocational themes piece and the informational interviews is sort of, they overlap a little bit with job development, but it still falls under the venue, the authorization, if you will, the process of discovery, where we go talk to business owners, not with the intention of job development, but to verify the themes to allow us to begin developing a list of potential employers. Once you've done that, discovery ends. There shouldn't be any more authorization for discovery. And at that point, everything that happens in the future is job development. And too often what we do is we jump to the job. We don't spend as much time in discovery, culminating in those strong vocational themes to guide us. And so that's what I hope that we can see through these informational interviews, is it's a tool to help lead you to the job development really, really quickly. Other questions? I'm kind of going through these myself, Kelly. I see some questions that are related to billing, and if I understand that correctly, Kelly, you will be dealing with those at a later date. Liz, that was your question about billable hours, and I think that's something that's it's out of my purview to answer that, but Kelly should be getting back with you all. Oh.
Patty, I think Kelly might be having a problem with her microphone, but I just wanted to follow up and say that, yes, we will, the CCLC will be compiling any questions related to billing and getting back to VR with those questions. We want to make sure that we get accurate answers. And so I see another question that just came up. It says, so 3 vocational themes are required to complete discovery.
And that's from Lori. Lori, that as we at Griffin Hammis teach this process, we believe that there should be 3 strong vocational themes, not more and not less, because we believe that we can combine concepts, ideas, skills, tasks, and interests into 3 broad arenas that will help us guide the employment. Any less, and we might not have an opportunity, and then we have to start all over again. I'm not sure that in your VR process in Indiana that it's required, although I remember through your forms that it allows you to start to think about a variety of vocational themes. And that's how we start. We want to come up with several and be able to, I think, in my point of view, and from Griffin Hammis's work, we have found that 3 really help guide us to a very strong job development plan. So I hope that's helpful. Any other questions, folks? I see if someone else is typing.
Patty, can you hear me?
I can. Is this Kelly?
Yes, so it looks like a VR counselor did step in and said that is not required for 3, but it is best practice.
I see that. That's Sandy. Thanks, Sandy.
Yes. Well, it looks like that might be the end of our questions at this time, so we want to thank you, Patty. And do you have any closing remarks?
I didn't even think about that, but thank you very much for having me. I certainly enjoy the discovery process and these informational interviews. I think that they're a really powerful tool that when in my early days of assisting people with disabilities and employment, I didn't employ this informational interview process, and it certainly takes a lot of the pressure off walking in and doing my first contact with the business is to try to secure employment. And of course, that wasn't always the best practice anyway. I think that developing a relationship and moving into it with conversation and acknowledging interests and commonality is the best approach to even job development. So I think that you will see through a lot of the work that we do, and certainly I'm sure any of you job developers who've been doing this a long time, we use the informational interview process even as we begin job development. And except at that point, we're a bit more focused on actually seeking employment opportunity. But we still do the same process of meeting with people, asking about how they got in their line of work, really spending some time getting to know people as we build on our relationship to the point of popping the question, if you will, asking for that marriage, our hand in marriage. But I think that this process certainly taught me a lot more about the skill sets needed for good job development, and I think that most people who are successful probably already do this process. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Patty. Everybody have a great day, and remember that on the CCL website, we will have this recording available for you.